It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Puris coming to you from Baltimore. China concluded its annual National People's Congress on Tuesday. Normally, the 16-day National People's Congress, which is China's legislature, is a routine affair. This time, however, it took many momentous decisions. For example, it abolished the two-term limit on the presidency. It strengthened anti-corruption institutions. It established a more powerful environmental regulatory body, and it re-elected Xi Jinping to a second term. Also, President Xi Jinping closing remarks struck a national chord, addressing issues such as China's claim over Hong Kong and Taiwan. Some analysts say that Xi Jinping is now China's most powerful ruler since the days of Mao Zedong. Joining me now to analyze the Congress is Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom. He is Chancellor's Professor of History at UC Irvine. His book, China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know, co-authored with Maura Elizabeth Cunningham. Jeffrey, I thank you so much for joining us today.
It's good to be back on the show.
All right, Jeffrey, the New York Times likened this year's National People's Congress to a coronation of Xi Jinping. Would you agree with this assessment?
Well, I think there's some relevance to it. It is conferring on him a very grand position. It sort of finishes off a process that's been going on for some time. Since he took power in 2012, he became head of the Chinese Communist Party, and that's really where his power largely comes from. He also then, early in 2013, took on the title of president, which is an important symbolic role, but the real power comes from heading the party. And then he gathered a lot of other titles to the point where Australian China specialist Jeremy Barmay began calling him the chairman of everything because it was too hard to keep track of all the things he was in charge of. And so there's been a maximizing this power going on. But then this added a kind of imperial flourish to it. So it's not a perfect analogy. There's no perfect analogy for exactly what he is, but there are things that are certainly like an emperor, that bring an emperor to mind. And there was a lot of buzz on the internet, including by Chinese critical of this, who were able to get around the firewall, likening him to an emperor. Xi Jinping, one way that they can't criticize him directly, but one way that people have been taking occasionally to mock him when they can get around the censors, is by likening to Winnie the Pooh, because he's a bit portly, like Winnie the Pooh the bear. And so there were starting to be on the internet, when it was announced that term limits would be done away with, images of Winnie the Pooh wearing a crown as a way of talking about this figure rising even higher.
And those social media complaints or resistance to this kind of taking of the throne by Xi Jinping was quickly shut down by state authorities. Was there any other way of expressing their discontent with this decision?
Well, we really just don't know how much discontent there is. It's very high cost to express discontent. That's been going on again, really, for quite a few years now. There's been a tightening and tightening, limiting of zones of freedom of expression. But there were a variety of ways that people tried who saw this as worrisome. There were people who posted up images of Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai was a warlord leader in the 19-teens. After the last dynasty had fallen, there was a new Republic of China established in 1912. And then a few years later, Yuan Shikai decided that he was going to make himself an emperor. He was tired of just being a president. And so people would just put up images of Yuan Shikai without comment. It's harder for the censors to keep up with images than with words. So if you use the word emperor, that became a banned word. All sorts of words got banned. The word Yuan Shikai got banned. All kinds of things got banned. We don't know the extent of discontent. There were a couple of quite bold people. An intellectual named Li Datong, who wrote an open letter saying, "I just can't stay silent at a time when something so terrible is happening in the country."
Now, let's switch gears to what actually took place during the Congress in terms of the key decisions that were made. What is most significant from your point of view?
So one of the things that was flagged as likely to happen, there was a big party Congress late last year in which Xi Jinping got reappointed to his position for leadership of the party, which again was a crucial thing. And it was flagged there that his particular ideology, Xi Jinping thought with socialism, with Chinese characteristics, was going to be elevated into the Constitution. So what's happened before is what's tended to happen is once a leader steps down, some policies associated with him are then included in the Constitution, or a slogan associated with the leader is included in the Constitution. But this was actually elevating his name, Xi Jinping, into this document. That hadn't been done for a living leader of the People's Republic of China since Mao. So this was part of the idea of a symbolic move that was saying this is somebody who is unlike a leader we've seen since Mao. And other things were going on that marked it the same way. And then, so the ending of term limits, which the last two leaders have abided by, these 10 years, and then you step down and make room for somebody else. And also you designate a successor 5 years ahead of time. So there's an orderly, routinized transition. That's what was thrown out the window with the ending of the 5-year terms. So it was sort of doing away, saying that routines, expectations were being upended. And there were other things that happened during this Congress that fit in with that upending of terms. In general, I think you could say for several decades now, there's been an effort to try to separate out things that the party does from things that the government does, and things that civil society does. And the trend was sort of slowly toward the party being a less omnipresent presence in people's lives. And what's been happening here in various ways before the Congress, but then sped up very recently, is more and more things are being consolidated, gathered together, taken over by the party again. The party propaganda apparatus is now having a more direct control over the media. And there are all sorts of things going on, which some people might say, people who support this, say this is just a way of making China's admired efficiency, which people around the world do look at the Chinese government and say they can really get things done. Some look at Xi Jinping and say he's a very effective leader. And so they would say just gathering more and more power into his hands and gathering more and more power into the party's hands would be furthering that kind of move toward efficiency. But it's also just a very worrisome set of moves. You have fewer and fewer checks and balances of any kind.
All right, Jeffrey, what are the dynamics in the Chinese political leadership and society that have led to a reversal of the policies followed by, say, Deng Xiaoping's presidency, when the leadership tried to redistribute power and to reverse Mao's very powerful central role that he had?
So there's been a move away from having a kind of charismatic leader and trying to have a leader who's more of a first among equals. And a lot of this idea was to help China get beyond and put behind it the chaos and uncertainty of particularly the last years that Mao was in power. He died in 1976. And the last 10 years, there was a lot of upheaval associated with the Cultural Revolution and a lot of uncertainty. And so there was a very self-conscious effort by the government to kind of rebrand itself, the party, as a more orderly and more of a rule by committee and not by a single man. So why exactly it's gone the other way under Xi Jinping? Some of the things going on fit in with things that began before he came to power. Before he came to power, the trend of there being from year to year more things you could discuss in private, a more robust civil society in different ways, more and more areas that the party didn't touch in private life. That had started to reverse even before he came to power, but he's certainly accelerated since he rose. And I think we really don't know. It's to be honest, and I think it's important for China specialists to be honest. it's such, there are so many obfuscations, so many things that make it difficult to get at what's really going on, especially in the upper echelons, that it's very hard to know. And we knew very little really about Xi Jinping as a person before this. But I think you can speculate on a few things. One is there's a trend towards strongman, personalistic rule in many different parts of the world right now. If it seemed for a while that there was a kind of global trend toward more democratic regimes, we're seeing a trend in many places toward more authoritarian regimes. And you can see parallels between things Xi Jinping has done and things that either appointed or elected leaders have done in many places. In Turkey, Erdogan has done some of these things. Modi in India, from a very different way to power, has done some things. So kind of setting up a very sort of muscular nationalism, and often then something approaching a cult of a leader in different places. Putin is one very clear example of this. So you could say that the world is more tolerant of this right now. The world is more distracted right now from issues in different parts. So it was an opportune time for somebody to strive to be this kind of a leader again. And there also are ways in which there are issues going on within China as well. China is getting stronger. There's an idea of being more assertive in the world. But there are also some issues that would cause the leadership some insecurity. And some of this, the trappings of sort of grandeur around Xi Jinping, can in part be a distraction of those. Growth rates, though still very high, are slowing a bit. So an idea of the party saying we deserve to rule because of this ongoing economic boom like nobody imagined, they're needing to come up with a different way of positioning themselves. And part of that can be increasing nationalistic propaganda and rhetoric and symbolism and gesturings toward having a very strong hand at the wheel, focusing on China's strength in the world, in part as a distraction from a time when economic growth rates are slowing and likely to slow more.
Jeffrey, I cannot not ask you this question. Trump announced on Thursday that he plans to impose another $60 billion worth of tariffs on advanced Chinese products. How do you think Xi Jinping will react to this, and how will it shape U.S.-China relations going forward? Because, you know, China was one of the countries that Trump first visited, and there seemed to be warm relations. He invited Xi Jinping and his wife to his Mar-a-Lago resort, and it seemed to me that things were on a good footing, but that seems to be changing with this tariff.
In terms of the actually economic costs, I mean, one of the hard things right now is so many products, so many things right now are entwined between the Chinese and American economy. So it's very hard to figure out how to actually do things that will only hurt one side or the other in this dynamic. I mean, it's one thing that I think helps protect U.S.-China relations from moving into really spinning out of control directions is that both sides are so dependent and so entwined with each other.
Jeffrey, I thank you so much for joining us today, and look forward to having more discussions with you to get a better understanding of the context under which not only Xi Jinping but others rule. You know, when I looked at some of the B-roll we were rolling in while you were talking about in the Congress, there was very little dissent in that Congress. Every decision that they voted on, you saw every hand going up. So I would like to get better understanding of these kinds of leadership and rule in China, and I hope you can join us then. Thank you so much.
I'll look forward to joining you again.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.